Return of the Jedi presents its climax as an ending, but structurally, it is only a release of tension, not a resolution, an emotional exhale that convinces the galaxy and the audience that something fundamental has been fixed when in reality, only the most visible symbol has been removed. The Emperor's death is framed as the collapse of tyranny itself, yet Palpatine was never the Empire's sole pillar. He was its embodiment, not its entirety. A singular will sitting atop an immense bureaucratic, military, and ideological machine that does not simply shut down when its operator is removed. The Imperial system was designed for continuity, fleets with layered command structures, governors with regional autonomy, intelligence networks embedded across worlds, and an economy already adapted to authoritarian control, none of which evaporate when the throne room explodes. What dies at Endor is the myth of invincibility, not the infrastructure of domination, and the narrative's focus on emotional closure obscures the fact that most of the Empire survives the night intact. Instead of peace, fragmentation follows. The Empire does not fall cleanly, it shatters. Regional commanders seize assets, admirals declare personal fiefdoms, moths entrench themselves behind loyal fleets, and the galaxy fractures into a patchwork of successor tyrannies. This fragmentation is arguably more dangerous than the unified empire. Oppression becomes localized, unpredictable, and harder to confront, with no single target for rebellion and no clear end state for victory. The galaxy trades one centralized nightmare for 1,000 smaller ones, each competing for power, resources, and legitimacy, dragging civilian populations into prolonged instability that lacks even the grim predictability of Imperial rule. Endor resolves Luke Skywalker's journey with exquisite precision. Vader is redeemed, the Sith lineage is broken, and the spiritual conflict at the heart of the trilogy finds closure. But this resolution belongs to the heroes, not the galaxy they inhabit. For trillions of civilians, nothing changes the next morning. Patrols still fly, taxes are still collected, governors still rule. And in many systems, imperial authority hardens rather than collapses as local leaders tighten control in the absence of oversight. The victory saves the protagonist from annihilation. It prevents immediate extinction via the Death Star, but it does not undo decades of damage inflicted on economies, ecosystems, and social structures across countless worlds. Stopping the Death Star is a necessary act, but it is a defensive one. It halts further catastrophe without addressing the wounds already sustained. Planets stripped of resources remain hollowed out. Populations displaced by war remain scattered, and trauma remains unacknowledged. The Rebel Alliance is emotionally prepared to win, but structurally unprepared to govern. It is a coalition of cells, activists, defectors, and idealists bound together by opposition, rather than a shared vision of administration. Winning a decisive battle does not magically transform insurgents into policymakers, logistics experts, jurists, or economic planners, and the saga offers little evidence that such preparation exists beneath the celebration. The Alliance has courage, conviction, and symbolism, but governing a galaxy requires continuity, compromise, and coercive capacity, qualities the rebels associate with the very tyranny they fought to overthrow. This creates an immediate vacuum, authority without legitimacy on one side, legitimacy without authority on the other, a mismatch that guarantees instability regardless of intent. The celebration on Endor is therefore not dishonest, but incomplete. It marks survival, not recovery, relief, not reconstruction. And the story encourages us to confuse these states because emotional resolution feels like closure. By focusing on joy, reunion, and symbolic triumph, the narrative allows the deeper crisis to fade into the background, even though it is only beginning to unfold. The Empire's collapse exposes how little of the galaxy was ever truly healed under Imperial rule. Oppression suppressed symptoms without resolving fractures, and once the pressure is gone, those fractures widen instantly. Trade networks break down, security collapses in marginal systems, and old grievances resurface, creating conditions ripe for prolonged conflict rather than peace. The rebels have no unified answer for this reality. Their identity is built around resistance, not stewardship, and the skills required to sabotage an empire are not the same as those required to replace it. This gap between victory and viability defines the post-Endor era, a moment where the bleeding stops just long enough for celebration, while the deeper infection remains untreated. The narrative treats this pause as an ending because endings are emotionally necessary, but structurally it is only an intermission, a temporary stabilization that postpones collapse rather than preventing it. Palpatine's ideology does not die with him. Authoritarianism, fear-based order, and the promise of stability through control are already embedded in the galaxy's political culture, ready to be repurposed by whoever can wield them most effectively. By resolving the conflict through personal redemption and symbolic defeat, the story privileges emotional truth over material reality, giving us a victory that feels complete even as the conditions for future disaster remain intact. Return of the Jedi closes a chapter, but it does not conclude the story it claims to finish. It pauses the fall long enough for hope to breathe, without building the structures required to sustain it. This is the core tension of the ending. It is true where it is intimate, and dangerously insufficient where it is systemic, a triumph that saves souls while leaving civilizations, suspended in uncertainty. From this unresolved state, the long consequences unfold quietly, shaped by fear, hesitation, and unfinished justice. Consequences that will define everything that comes after, whether the galaxy is ready to face them or not. The idea that the bleeding stopped becomes the most dangerous illusion of all, because it reframes survival as success and silence as stability, allowing the galaxy to move forward without ever asking whether it is actually capable of standing on its own legs again. After Endor, there is a collective rush to define the moment as an ending, not because it truly is one, but because exhaustion demands it. Civilizations battered by decades of fear want permission to rest, and the narrative of victory grants that permission without requiring proof of recovery. Relief is mistaken for healing. The absence of an immediate existential threat feels like safety, and that feeling becomes the foundation on which the New Republic tries to build, despite having no real diagnostic understanding of the damage left behind. Trauma is not addressed because trauma resists neat conclusions. It lingers, distorts behavior, and demands long-term care, all things that clash with the desire to declare a clean break from the past. Instead, trauma is buried under ceremony, medals, speeches, and symbolic transitions of power, gestures that reassure the galaxy emotionally while leaving its psychological and structural wounds untouched. Worlds that suffered under the Empire are expected to reintegrate seamlessly, as if oppression did not reshape economies, cultures, and trust itself, as if decades of fear can be shed the moment a banner changes. Refugees are treated as temporary inconveniences rather than evidence of systemic failure. Displaced populations scatter across marginal systems, stretching already fragile infrastructures, while the core celebrates freedom it can afford to believe in. No comprehensive effort is made to rebuild destroyed planets, because rebuilding forces confrontation with loss, accountability, and resource allocation, all of which threaten the fragile political unity holding the New Republic together. It is easier to declare that the war is over than to admit that the consequences will last generations, and so the galaxy chooses the language of closure even as reality refuses to cooperate. This refusal creates cognitive dissonance. Leaders speak of peace, while security deteriorates, of justice while criminals vanish into obscurity, of unity, while systems quietly rearm themselves against uncertainty. The New Republic's fear of becoming the Empire calcifies into institutional timidity. Strength is conflated with tyranny, authority with abuse, and enforcement with moral failure, producing a government that equates restraint with righteousness, regardless of outcome. This mindset treats power itself as suspect, rather than interrogating how power is wielded, resulting in structures too weak to protect those who depend on them, yet too proud to acknowledge their inadequacy. Justice already compromised becomes increasingly symbolic. High-profile trials provide the illusion of accountability, while countless lower-level perpetrators melt back into society, carrying their methods, beliefs and grievances with them. The message is clear: survival matters more than responsibility. And history confirms that this lesson will always be learned by those most willing to exploit it. Former Imperial officers do not abandon ideology. They refine it, shedding the trappings that made the Empire vulnerable. replacing overt terror with administrative control, nostalgia, and selective memory. They speak not of domination, but of order, not of fear, but of safety, reframing authoritarianism as a corrective to chaos rather than its cause, and finding receptive audiences among populations exhausted by instability. The New Republic underestimates this adaptation because it believes ideology died with Palpatine, failing to recognize that ideas survive precisely because they are portable, flexible, and emotionally resonant in times of uncertainty. While democratic institutions debate legitimacy and jurisdiction, their adversaries reorganize with clarity, unburdened by moral hesitation and empowered by the very freedoms meant to prevent tyranny. This asymmetry accelerates decay. Good faith governance moves slowly because it must, while predatory movements move quickly because they can, and time becomes a weapon wielded against patience itself. Return of the Jedi therefore marks not the end of collapse, but a temporary stabilization, a moment where momentum slows just enough for hope to breathe, even as the deeper structural failures continue to erode unseen. The galaxy interprets this pause as proof that everything worked, that courage and belief were sufficient, and this misinterpretation becomes the foundation for the next failure. History is remembered selectively. Endor becomes mythologized as definitive rather than contingent, its context flattened into a story of good triumphing over evil, stripped of the warnings embedded within it. This mythologizing is comforting, but it is also corrosive, because it replaces vigilance with reverence, teaching future generations to look backward for inspiration instead of forward for prevention. Hope becomes retrospective rather than active, anchored to what once worked rather than what must now be built, and this orientation leaves the galaxy perpetually unprepared for change. The return of darkness does not feel like a betrayal of the victory. It feels like an interruption of peace, reinforcing the belief that the problem is resurgence rather than continuity. Few stop to ask whether the galaxy ever truly transitioned out of crisis mode, or whether it simply learned to live with unresolved damage long enough to call it normal. The patient metaphor becomes painfully accurate. Emergency intervention saved a life, but rehabilitation was never undertaken. The wound closed superficially while infection spread beneath the surface. The galaxy limps forward, functional but fragile, stable enough to survive, too weak to thrive, and dangerously confident in its own resilience. When new threats emerge, they are framed as anomalies rather than consequences, external evils rather than internal failures, allowing the same cycle of reaction to repeat without introspection. Return of the Jedi gives permission to believe in endings, but the galaxy that follows proves that endings without rebuilding are merely pauses, temporary reprieves in a longer decline. The victory is real, meaningful, and necessary, but it is not sufficient, and the tragedy lies not in its limitations, but in the refusal to acknowledge them. By mistaking emotional resolution for structural repair, the galaxy sets itself up to relive its trauma under new names, convinced each time that this will be the last war, the final collapse, the definitive victory. The saga's brilliance is that it allows this contradiction to exist without resolving it, offering hope that saves souls while showing a civilization unable to save itself. Endor stops the bleeding, but no one stays to monitor the patient. No one commits to the slow, unglamorous work of recovery. And so the galaxy rises too soon, applauds too loudly, and listens too little to the quiet warnings beneath the celebration.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.